everyone. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I am going to do a read aloud from one of my favorite reading sites online, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, I want to introduce you to this awesome website, but second of all, I've started creating these read aloud videos for my students. I'm a third grade teacher in an elementary school here in Statesboro, Georgia, and we just found out yesterday that we're not going to be able to return to school at least until late April, and maybe not, things are so unknown. And it made me realize, wow, I am going to miss out on a lot of stuff with my students, not just 2 weeks here or 3 weeks here or 4 weeks here. I mean, this is a long time that we're going to be apart. And so one of the things that I do with my class is we read stories all the time. Not just small stories, like one book, like I've been doing, but we read novels. And so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to read one chapter out of a fun novel that we would normally be reading in my class. And then we'll get to continue reading together through a phone call, video call called Zoom, and I'll send out information in an email very shortly if you're in my class. But if you're not in my class, what I would love to do is show you the website where I'm reading from so that you can continue reading this story if you like this story. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, so there is a website absolutely free called Epic. And it's kind of like Netflix, except for it's filled with children's books, all different ages, I feel like all the way through age 12. There's tons of books on here, fiction, nonfiction. They even have Spanish books. Not only do they have books, but they also have learning videos. They have audio books where you just press play and listen. They have books that can read to you. And so you can go to getepic.com and sign up for a free account. Now, it's free for educators, or it has been free for educators. And so your teacher probably has an account. So if you are a parent during this time where we're staying at home, they're offering free access at home, and you just need to contact your teacher for that free learning code for home. I'm going to click over to my account and type in the story that I want, which is Sideways Stories. Okay, here it is, Sideways Stories from Wayside School, and I would just click on the book and it pulls it up automatically. And the really cool thing, it tells you how many pages there are, what ages it's geared for, what the AR level is, and just like if you're familiar with any other e-reader, you would just click on the left and the right side of the screen to turn the page. Really cool thing from Epic, if you don't know what a word is, you're reading all by yourself. Let's say I didn't know what this word was. Okay, click it.
Sideways.
And it tells me how to say it, but it also tells me the part of speech it is and some definitions. So really cool. Anyway, here we go. This is the introduction before the author starts the chapters. He gives us a little introduction about some information that we're going to need before we read this book. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be only one story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. But instead, it is 30 stories high with one classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. Now, the children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly, and that is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That is probably also true. Chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. Now, Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher at Wayside School. In Wayside School, she taught the class on the 30th story. "If you children are bad," she warned, "or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples." Mrs. Gorf didn't like children. Now Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anyone else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. "I do not allow crying in the classroom," said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and when they went home, they were too scared even to talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Marisha tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Marisha opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Marisha became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. And then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Marisha, and the 3 Erics. Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Lewis, the yard teacher, which is what we would call like our PE coach, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room, and he saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. "Now I can go home," she said. "I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again." "You're not going anywhere," shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. "Stop!" she shouted, "or I'll turn you into applesauce!" But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. "Turn us back into children," Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time the left one first, and then her right, and she turned the apples back into children. "All right," said Marisha. "Let's go get Lewis. He'll know what to do." "No!" screamed Mrs. Gorf. "I'll turn you back into apples." She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. And even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. "Where's Mrs. Gorf?" he asked. Nobody said a word. "Boy, am I hungry," said Louis. "I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many." He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. Okay, so that was chapter 1 of our Sideways stories from Wayside School. And like I said, it's silly and funny, but there are 29 more chapters. So if you really liked this book, you can go and read it at getepic.com. Like I said, it's for free, and if you need to contact your teacher, just send her an email, or him. But if you are in my class, we will continue to read it together, and I will send your parents more information soon. So I miss y'all. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Go outside and have some fun, and don't forget to read, read, read. Bye.